Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Phoenix's Tale. I am your host, Gabe, and this week we are going to be diving into Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 5, The Whomping Willow. So let's get to the recap before we dive into our discussion this week. We read that Harry had the best month of his life at the Burrow with the Weasleys. And some of the things that stuck out here was the fact that the Weasleys really seemed to enjoy having him around. Mrs. Weasley was fussing over him, making sure he had plenty of food to eat at every meal. And you just know Mr. Weasley was just bombarding Harry with questions about muggles because he knows Harry grew up with muggles. So I'm sure this was a lot of fun for Harry being in a place where people actually wanted him around. As we open the chapter, it's time to head back to Hogwarts, and Ron and Harry, being the last two to cross the barrier onto platform 9 3/4, find that the barrier is blocked and they can't get through. And having missed the Hogwarts Express, their 12-year-old minds think the best course of action is to just take the car, because Harry and the Weasleys all arrived at King's Cross Station this particular year in the flying Ford Anglia that Ron, Fred, and George used to rescue Harry from Privet Drive a couple weeks ago. However, things don't quite go Harry and Ron's way. They're thinking this is a big adventure at first, but then it quickly, gets tiresome. The car starts to overheat, but thankfully they are approaching Hogwarts and make it onto the grounds before the car crashes into the Whomping Willow. So they just barely make it to Hogwarts. Snape finds them outside as Harry and Ron are looking into the windows of the Great Hall, and they see the first years lining up to be sorted. So Snape finds them, escorts them down to his office, goes to collect Professor McGonagall, fully expecting Harry and Ron to be expelled. Harry and Ron were expecting to be expelled, but because it's up to Professor McGonagall, as she is their head of house, she decides to give them both detentions for their stupidity. And while everyone in Gryffindor House celebrates, when we see Harry and Ron returning to the Gryffindor common room, everybody's celebrating and thinking, oh man, this is really great, except for Percy and Hermione, obviously. So the start of term for Harry and Ron was not the spectacular entrance they were hoping when they left King's Cross that morning in the car. So the first focus, I first want to focus on the part of the chapter where Harry, Ron, Snape, McGonagall, and Dumbledore are in Snape's office. And they're discussing what happened to prompt Harry and Ron to take the car instead of the more obvious solution, which was just to wait for Mr. and Mrs. Weasley to come back through. Or Professor McGonagall mentions it in the chapter, why you've got an owl, why didn't you just send her and let us know what was up? And ask for help. The specifics of this particular part, that scene in Snape's office with Snape, McGonagall, Dumbledore, Harry, and Ron, reflects to me a couple of different issues. There is the outright fear of authority figures, which, we've seen thus far with the Dursleys. We know that to be the case with Harry's, and specifically with Uncle Vernon. We see that with this chapter and the description of, Harry felt like, oh shit, whatever trouble we get, we deserve this. They just don't want to be expelled is all. So the fear of authority figures, anticipatory shame, and childhood punishment patterns. And for me, specifically where this ties to my story is that fear of authority figures, which is what we're going to be primarily focusing on this week. We're not going to worry about the anticipatory shame or the childhood punishment patterns. And we see this, as I just mentioned, with Harry throughout the entire series, with Snape and Uncle Vernon most notably. However, it is with Professor McGonagall where we see Harry being confident enough to explain that he and Ron shouldn't have any points deducted because he remembers vividly what happened in Sorcerer's Stone when he and Hermione were trying to get Norbert to Charlie's friends, and Neville was trying to warn them. And in the process, the three of them lose 50 points each, so 150 points. So we know that this is on Harry's mind. Professor, term hadn't started. You don't need any points taken off. And she agreed and decided that they'll have detention. And Ron and Harry agree. They don't care. As long as they're not expelled, as long as, Harry doesn't have to carry the shame of losing a ginormous number of points in one go. Detention, okay, he can deal with that. However, it is Snape's attitude towards Harry that we feel the beginnings of this in this chapter specifically, and that he was truly hoping for Harry and Ron to be expelled for their stunt. We see this down the road with Snape's insinuating that he will be poisoning Harry in potions class that happened in Goblet of Fire, and attempting to outright curse him in Defense Against the Dark Arts in Half-Blood Prince. So we'll circle back to this a couple of times later in the series, but here is where in my life that I felt I have often feared authority, and it has to do with my father, as always. To be honest, I don't ever remember feeling validated from any authority figure, because I've always seemed to be let down by anyone who should have protected me. I have talked a number of times about the fact that I am working through the things that my mother did in my childhood that I really wish she hadn't done, or things that she didn't do that I really wish she had, specifically in relation to how the effects of my father's verbal abuse, she kind of made things worse. And so I'm working through and processing all of that for myself. So feeling like I really couldn't go to my mom with a lot of things. I definitely couldn't go to my dad. I, as a child, didn't trust authority figures at all. It always seemed to me that, even with my teachers throughout school, there would always be something at some point in the school year where I did something to disappoint a teacher. And I felt like that was it. I felt this enormous shift in, oh, they don't like me anymore. I'm not a good student. I'm not everything that they always say nice on my report cards. I was the good kid. I basically grew up fearing authority figures, not trusting authority figures, because they never showed up when I needed them to. However, this, as I was thinking about it, doing my research and writing this episode, is a newer topic for me to dive into and process what happened. So it's going to take some time for me to uncover some of those fuzzier memories, which is what I call it, and to find an authority figure that maybe I did trust that I can't think about right now. This is common for children who have had abusive childhoods where there's been some sort of neglect, in my case, emotional neglect. It is very common with children who had rough childhoods to not have a lot of memories of it, because just surviving in the here and now in an environment like that, it takes a lot of energy, mentally, emotionally, and even physically, such that I'm going to need some time to come up, because certainly there had to have been somebody that I trusted, somebody who was an authority figure that I trusted. So as much as I would like to dive more into this for myself right now, I really can't. So stay tuned. I'll get there, and I'll be bringing that to you throughout the course of this podcast when I do find those moments and it connects with the particular chapter we're on. But for now, stay tuned. I'm not entirely sure if I've got an authority figure from childhood that I did trust, so I'll find it if there is one. Anyway, I've mentioned often that growing up with my father was full of anxiety, stress, and confusion for all the times I was shouted at, insulted, etc., but never truly understanding why. Because my father didn't explain a lot. He always spoke to me and my brothers as though we were already adults and should already know these things, when that's not the case. We were children. This is how we learn. But we don't learn when we're shouted at and insulted and ridiculed as a form of punishment for something we did wrong, if our father never explained what was wrong about it, just that it was wrong and don't do it again. So let's dive into some of the actual research. I was going to say something else, but I think that needs to wait for another episode. So we're going to dive into some of the actual research. And as always, my references for this are in the show notes in the description below. So growing up with a verbally abusive, inconsistent father can profoundly distort one's relationship to authority, leading to chronic anxiety and confusion, especially when you add in the fact that I'm autistic. That had a lot to do with it. There it is in my notes. Especially for autistic individuals who process social hierarchies differently than neurotypicals do. I need to just read my note. Sorry about that. Anyway, children who experience verbal and emotional abuse from a parent tend to internalize that distrust and anxiety in the face of authority figures throughout life. One study found that parental verbal abuse correlates with higher depression, anxiety, stress, anger, and lower self-esteem in young adults. Oh boy. 23, almost 24-year-old me 30 years ago. Yeah, I just almost don't recognize myself from back then. Anyway, so all of those things significantly affect emotional development. How I have overcome the emotional immaturity, and specifically with my father's reactions. Boy, he would just lose his shit like that. And sometimes publicly. That was never fun. But these effects can manifest as hypervigilance and or avoidance behaviors. I got both. I am hypervigilant, but I tend to avoid situations. I do not like conflict. Of course, as an adult, it's gotten easier for me to, for lack of a better term, train myself when I need to stand up for myself or say something to somebody. But yeah, I tend to avoid conflict at all possible. Anyway, I got to backtrack my notes here. These effects can manifest as hypervigilance or avoidance behaviors, with individuals feeling threatened or judged even when no explicit danger is present. Yes, that was a big one for me. The inconsistency of an abusive parent, that vacillating between punishment, neglect, or occasional praise. Didn't quite believe the praise I actually got from my father, because it was inconsistent with his actions, and we all know actions speak louder than words. That inconsistency creates confusion. Yeah, I was confused a lot as a child, and erodes any sense of safety or predictable caregiving. Survivors often generalize these reactions to all authority figures such as teachers, bosses, and law enforcement, perceiving them as unpredictable or punitive rather than protective. And this wariness is an adaptive response rooted in early relational trauma. So, yeah, I can count on one hand. In fact, I've only ever had 2 bosses out of all the jobs I've had across several decades. I'll leave it at that. There were only 2 that I actually trusted and felt like they let me do my thing. As long as I did the job well and got it done on time, that's all they cared about. They didn't micromanage. But there were only 2 of them. So I'm sure that's something you've all experienced as well. Anyway, autistic people frequently report heightened anxiety and misunderstanding in dynamics with authority due to differences in processing social cues and hierarchies. This is where I've struggled, but we'll get into that. Neurotypical expectations around obedience and unspoken rules can be especially stressful for autistic individuals, making authority interactions a source of ongoing anxiety and cognitive dissonance. I need to talk about cognitive dissonance at some point. Let me make a note. Okay. These layers of confusion compound the impact of parental abuse, making it harder to develop trust and autonomy. I feel like I have been fighting for my freedom my entire life and just wanting to be myself. And it's been a lot. Now, what I'm going to say next is one of the surprises I found in learning what it means to be autistic, because it definitely explains a certain mindset that I have carried my entire life. Social hierarchies and authority figures. Autistic individuals frequently experience confusion or skepticism regarding social hierarchies and authority figures, and our respect for authority is often grounded in logic, fairness, and demonstrated competence rather than position alone. In other words, how the fuck did this person get to be the boss? Or how the hell did that person get to be the boss? When they are just absolute fucking idiots. They're, just as abusive as my father was. Whatever the situation, I'm sure you've all asked yourself at one point with one boss or another that you've had, how the hell did this person get to be a leader of any kind in this organization? That's how autistics think. Rather than position. Okay, autistic people tend to display reduced status-seeking behaviors. Yeah. And often find traditional status markers and hierarchies illogical or irrelevant. Instead of deferring to someone simply because of their boss or authority label, autistic individuals usually require evidence of genuine expertise, fairness, or earned respect before giving deference or loyalty. Absolutely true. Studies and qualitative reports suggest that this tendency is rooted in a strong personal ethic of justice, transparency, and logical reasoning. Past experiences of trauma, including growing up with inconsistent or unsafe authority figures, can heighten this wariness and amplify hypervigilance in authority interactions. It abso-fucking-lutely does. Autistic adults often perceive authority not as something to be blindly accepted, but as a potential site of injustice or danger, especially when power is exerted arbitrarily or without accountability. This can mean that respect is reserved for those who act with real merit, fairness, and competence rather than those who simply hold a title. Again, the two bosses that I had that I absolutely loved, who just let me get on with it. They trusted I would do a great job and that I would get it done on time, whatever tasks they were. Stumbling a little bit here. It is because they proved through their actions, as far as I was concerned, that they were right. They were the right person for that role. They were good bosses. They were good leaders. They listened. They were fair. All the things that I personally come to expect from somebody who has that seniority over me, or who is managing me, or who is my boss, however you want to say that. Everybody else, to some degree or another, has just didn't really have my respect because they didn't earn it. And I'm not going to just blindly respect somebody just because a group of people says so, because they're the boss, they're the manager, they're the supervisor, whatever. Current research to say that autistic people typically do not equate somebody's position with a right to respect or obedience. That sentence did not make sense. Current research says that autistic people typically do not equate someone's position with a right to respect or obedience. Instead, that sounded better. Instead, respect is earned through expertise, consistency, and justice, reinforced by a lifetime of navigating both autistic difference and, for some, histories of trauma and heightened alertness to power misuse. I thought that one was interesting. Power misuse. Yeah, I would say my father misused his power. A couple hours ago, I was having a very interesting conversation with Michigan brother. He's the baby of the family. And just how similar our experiences were with our father individually. Even though I am the oldest, there's a 5-year and 3-month age difference between the two of us. And then California brother, the middle child, he's in there roughly the halfway point. Closer in age to me than he is to baby brother, though. But there's a lot of similarities with all that, and we were just having an interesting conversation about all that. You know, the descriptions that he was given about how he felt, and you know, those moments where I talked about an episode or two ago about social situations with my father. He didn't care what any of us were doing. He didn't care that we didn't want to be there. We had to be there for some dumb reason. And once we were there, he didn't give a shit what we did or what was going on or what was happening. He didn't care. It was just all for show for our father. And Michigan brother and I are the two who picked up on my father's bullshit a lot faster than California brother does. California brother's still kind of trying to hang on to some kind of relationship, like he's going to have some kind of relationship with our father, because it still hasn't really sunk into him that nothing has changed with him. absolutely nothing has changed. Where Michigan brother and I are like, yeah, no, nothing's changed, and I'm done dealing with this shit. And speaking of bosses, I'm looking at my notes here. The two bosses that I had, out of all the bosses I've ever had throughout my life, have been worthy, in my opinion, of my loyalty and my respect for them. So everything that we just talked about here, it makes a lot of sense to me. So as we close out this week's episode, again, I know this is going to be a shorter episode. As I mentioned in my re-recording of episode 2, or chapter 2, and my month-long didn't really do anything with the podcast, with my mental health and everything like this. There are going to be shorter episodes throughout Chamber of Secrets because it is my least favorite of the entire series. And as such, I'm finding it more difficult to find aspects of my life that directly connect to Harry's. So I'm looking at the time. We're going to close this out in about 30 minutes today. So I do have to say that nothing will change for me in this respect because I've longed to be my own boss in any way. And that is where I'm focusing my efforts with this podcast and with my content creation on social media. That's something I'm still struggling with, but I'll get there. And at the time of this recording, in fact, the social media part has been a struggle. As I just said, I need to read through my notes before I start talking. And I'll continue working on that. I'll eventually break through whatever mental barrier I have about social media, because I was doing great earlier in the year and at different parts last year on TikTok. Just, I got something to say, hit record and just post a video. And for some reason, I'm struggling with that right now, but I'll get there. And to be perfectly honest, that's all any of us can do when we're dealing with trauma and or just being neurodivergent. I hear from a lot of content creators who are OCD, who are ADHD, who have both ADHD and autism, other autistics, etc., talk about that struggle sometimes as well. So it's not necessarily about any trauma. It could be just our neurodivergent ways getting in the way there. So continue working on being the best version of ourselves as we possibly can. That is my advice going out, not just to all of you, but to myself as well. I'm just going to do the best I can. And I know eventually I'm going to get over that mental block I have with social media and get back on track with that again. And that's what really has been driving me lately, is being the best version of myself that I possibly can. Also, if Michigan brother just walked through, sorry about that. The other part of it is, if I'm my own boss, I don't have to worry about stupid people being my boss, okay? When I can clearly see that they don't deserve that position. And I've had some doozies over the decades, let me tell you. I'm not going to go into any specifics. I'm not going to call anybody out. But I've had some bosses that should not have been bosses. And that's why I want to be my own boss. I want to control my life. I want to control how I earn money. I want to control what I do and my workflow and my schedule. I want to control all of it. I don't want somebody else telling me what to do. I just don't like doing that. So that wraps things up for me this week. Again, my apologies for the tardiness of this episode. I talked about it a couple weeks ago in chapter 2. But I'm getting back on track with my mental health, getting back on track to where I want to be recording these episodes. So thankfully, if you are watching these in real time, I am on chapter 5. Today is October 17th. this episode should have aired 2 days ago. So I'm getting caught up. And I'll continue to be honest and transparent with all of you, because if I don't do that with my struggles, how the hell is it supposed to help any of you? Is my thought. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately with some of the people that I'm drawn to currently on social media and who I'm listening to, is they're the ones that are coming across authentic, and this is my life and this is my struggle. And that's why I'm choosing to not overly edit my podcast episodes. I'm just hitting record. I'm talking, I do research. I do have an entire script for myself. I always go off track, and then I should have read my notes before I hit record, so I know that I don't have to go off track. Just wait. It's further on in the episode. But I'm not going to mask or hide my struggles anymore. I'm so fucking tired of masking. I'm so fucking tired of not saying the things I want to say, because it speaks to some kind of wound I have that goes directly back to my childhood and my father's treatment of me and my brothers. And like I said, how am I supposed to help anyone? How is anybody supposed to help anyone else if you're not being authentic? And being hypervigilant, I can sniff out inauthenticity 10 miles away. Maybe not. Okay. Anyway, that does it for me for this week. Thanks again for your patience with me. Join me next week when we discuss Chapter 6, Gilderoy Lockhart. Oh boy. That one, I've already done the research and the writing for that, so that one's going to be a very interesting conversation, because we really dive into some serious psychology with that one. So until then, watch out for the Whomping Willow, and